All right, let's get started. I want to value the time of all of you that are taking to join us today. As you all know, this is we've been ongoing close to a year with the Member Matters webinar. We didn't call it that when we started, but named it that. We will actually continue them post-pandemic if we can get to that post-pandemic space. For many of you are familiar faces, so you're aware of how this works. We're in a space where we're bringing topics to you. Sometimes it's you guys discussing amongst yourself what's going on in your districts and what you're doing. Other times we've brought in some guests to start the conversation. We've done that today. As we looked at the timing of your school year, you're in the space where you're now coming up on budget season and thinking about next year and what that looks like. And one of the things that I'm sure your district is going to start grappling with is, as we move from what this year looked like, where you've had some percentage of your families remote, if not all of them, we know that there is going to be a group of your students that look at next fall and tell their school district, we would like to continue to be remote 100% of the time moving forward. And districts are going to deal with that in different ways. But I thought it would be useful because I'm sure that it creates a lot of questions in your minds. I thought it would be useful to turn to our Michigan resident experts in this space, which is Michigan Virtual. Some of you likely have relationships with them as school districts already. And as an organization, I can almost, if I was younger, throw a baseball from their office to my office. Probably can't make that throw anymore, but we have three people from Michigan Virtual with us today. I'm going to start in a conversation with them with some questions that I have to get things rolling. We have the chat open, so as we talk and you have questions, please throw those into the chat. And when we get, partway through the conversation today, we may open it up to hand raising and going back and forth that way with verbal questions. We'll just play it by ear as we go into that, but please start putting questions in chat as you have them. And so I will introduce our three guests today. We have Mr. Jamie Fitzpatrick, who is the president and CEO of Michigan Virtual. Jamie just waved. We have Dr. Chris Harrington, who is the director of Michigan Virtual's Learning Research Institute. And we have Dr. Shannon Smith, Director of Student Learning Services for Michigan Virtual. So people that are very familiar with both the student and teaching side and offering side of virtual school and what that looks like. And of course, also career educators in a regular setting, so they understand both sides of this. And I've known Jamie for a number of years. He's kind of been at the helm of Michigan Virtual for over a decade, I am sure, at this point, Jamie. And we often, collaborate on things, and Michigan Virtual often has also been a business partner with MASB, and you've seen them at our conferences, and we've always appreciated that support from Jamie and his team. And so I am going to jump into the questions, and I'll let the three of you kind of see who wants to lead into things. But you heard what I said to the members that are on today, and I think for a lot of districts, they're going to start thinking about this. And we had laws in Michigan that really were on the other side of this, saying that you must offer a minimum number if a student requests and they've exhausted, the local options. Like we were, in some ways, fairly restrictive in that space because the funding always doesn't flow well in Michigan when we go down this road. But I think we went through this pandemic, and now it won't surprise me to see 5%, 10%, who knows, that will come to the superintendents this year and say, hey, my kid thrived in this environment, and are you going to be able to offer a full-time online experience for my student in the fall? And if not, there are they're going to probably say there are virtual charter schools, or they're going to say a neighboring district can do the same thing and offer that. And I'm interested from the three of you, like, what do you see on the horizon? Have you been getting contact from districts in this space? Michigan, maybe Jamie, you want to talk about Michigan Virtual. Historically, you have not been providing 100% online education to individual students. But I also understand your expertise in this space.
Yeah, so Don, thank you for having us. It might be helpful just to give a kind of a 30-second update about who we are. We're a nonprofit 501c3. We were actually created by the state back in 1998 to address workforce development issues, but began working in the K-12 space in 2000. And since that time, we've delivered well over 300,000 online courses to Michigan high school kids and middle school kids, but more at the high school level. In addition to providing online courses to students, we also deliver professional development. And this past year, we delivered around 300,000 continuing credit hours. Sketches is what they're called, so that educators could maintain their credentials. And then Chris is with our research institute. We recognize that online and blended learning has been around a long time, but it's still really in its infancy. And there's a lot of best practices that are still being learned. And our goal is to try to teach people how to fish, knowing that historically we have been a supplemental provider. So nobody's ever graduated from Michigan Virtual. 90-some% of the kids that we serve are taking a single class with us online, and they're taking the balance of their coursework at a public school, a non-public school, or in some cases they're being homeschooled. And I'll turn it over to Chris and Shannon. The one thing that I would say in answering your question, Don, is it's almost impossible to measure the impact of what COVID has done to our system. I mean, just think back a year ago, if somebody had said to all of you as policymakers in your respective districts, we're going to implement one virtual day when we have a snow day, it would have been a Herculean lift. And that was just one snow day. And so the world has changed, and COVID has accelerated all decision-making. And one of the byproducts of that, I believe, is you're going to see families making choices in ways that we historically have never seen before. And I don't have a crystal ball. I just have spoken to a lot of people, superintendents notably. One superintendent from Southeastern Michigan told me if we open the doors next fall the same way we used to operate before COVID, largely on a bell schedule, we know, because we've been surveying our families, we're going to lose somewhere between 9 and 12% of our students. They're going to go elsewhere. So I think that that's probably a reality. I don't know if that reality is uniform in all regions of the state. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Chris and Shannon to share their perspectives.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thanks for having us. I agree with everything that you said, Jamie. When we look at schools and what they're trying to do for the fall, the conversations have started. Conversations in a lot of schools have started even back in November and December of last year. And the fact of the matter is, as things play out further along this school year, I think it's becoming clear that there's going to be uncertainty with the start of the next school year. And where schools are starting to look now is recognizing what Jamie said about there are going to be a segment of the student population by student choice, but then also by family choice, where they want to stay in a virtual learning model, in a virtual learning environment. You know, and it's tricky because sometimes that's not the best environment for kids, right? And when we experienced this shift back in the spring of last year, because of the school closures, I don't think we can really call that virtual learning. I think that was emergency teaching and learning. Some people are calling it pandemic learning. It's basically, we got pushed out of the physical school buildings, and now we had to make do with whatever we could do. And the difference between virtual learning and this pandemic teaching and learning is, in a virtual learning program, you're very well structured and your model has been planned. And I think that's where we see some of our pain points right now. But because of the uncertainty, I think for sure we're going to be seeing that there's going to be a strong virtual component to schools moving forward. You know, we don't know what will stick completely, and it will vary from school district to school district based on what the school district values and what they want to do, where they want to be in the space. But I think the school districts that I'm working with right now, we do some consulting services as well and help schools actually get further down this road with their own in-house programs. And where these schools are looking right now is we need to have something in place and just be ready for this. No matter what the fall is going to bring us, we need to be ready, and we're going to need to have some components all ready to go and teed up. Shannon, you've seen you've seen a lot of increases in our school. Your thoughts on that?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think this has provided an opportunity to provide resources to students that we may not have realized they were interested in the past. And so, Don, to your point, we've seen Michigan Virtual has acknowledged us for several years now. There are students that come to life in the online environment that didn't in the traditional environment. It's certainly not the best environment for all students, but it provides us now with an opportunity to see what we can do to meet those students' needs in new ways.
Chris, you mentioned, it's not always, and Shannon, you just alluded to it too, it may not be always the best environment for a student. And so, I mean, that's in large part why Michigan law was written the way it was, where there was kind of sign off by the district to say this student makes sense for them to do that. And clearly we've seen as schools this year, a lot of people have now started calling them the lost students. I mean, kids that they're not engaged in online or in-person learning at all. And whether their families have chosen to use this as a way out, or if they just, whatever the situation might be, we have them. But then we have this group of kids where clearly, hopefully their family will realize that if online learning is not for them, that they've really struggled this year, even if they have connectivity, that when we get to next fall and a district offers that option, that is not a student that's picking the option, because ultimately, all of the school board members and SUPs that are on today, and the teachers particularly, they get held responsible for how these students achieve, and thus have to have some say in whether online learning would be the right fit for somebody. And I think that's probably going to create some real friction too within that parent choice perspective, where a district's going to have to make the decision where the parent says, well, I can go to this online school that's either virtual or whatever it might be, or I can homeschool and do this. If you can lose the money at the school district, or you can decide to keep me in whatever online school you're offering and take the money, even if you don't think my kid is in that space. And I do think as board members and as superintendents, like that's going to have to be a decision that they have to grapple with, almost like, do we do, and this is a tough place for school board members, really, like, do we do what we think is the right thing educationally based on recommendations from teachers and say, we don't want to be, I'll say it, this sounds bad, but complicit in an education that isn't going to go in a direction that it should, but we're going to lose the money? Or is there, another, or do we take their money and put them in our online school, be held accountable for the fact that maybe that isn't a good environment for them? The schools didn't have that choice this fall. I do expect the legislature at some point, and whether they do it fast enough to grapple with things for next fall, I probably question whether they are going to do that. But I do see this learning environment conversation at the district easier for some kids, for a school district to sign off on doing it, much harder for another group of kids where schools still are responsible. Even if the state didn't hold them responsible, they feel responsible for how well a student's going to do.
Yeah, Don, it's interesting. I made the comment that, this doesn't work for all kids, and I'm going to argue against myself here, where it doesn't work for all kids because of the way we've been working with kids historically. The fact of the matter is, when you do research and you look at training programs, in the workforce, much of that is online now, right? Or at least it's some sort of a hybrid of online and face-to-face. And when you think about the options for kids at the higher education level, they can get all of their degrees, advanced degrees, fully online. So at some point we have to wrestle philosophically with, is this a life skill now that we do have to get kids ready for? So I think as long as we have school choice, families can choose where they'll be learning, we have to be ready for that. Just a real quick story. In Pennsylvania, we had I live in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And we had, this was back in the recession, back in like 2008, 2009. School districts had multi-million-dollar shortfalls in their budget. And we have a very similar funding formula in Pennsylvania as in Michigan, where the money follows the kid. If a family decides they want to go to a cyber charter school, they can do that, but then the school district has to foot the bill for that. And that's very painful. And it was during that time, school districts across Pennsylvania were trying to jam in their own in-house virtual learning programs, and they didn't do it well because they had a quick hurry up and do this. And they didn't have all the pre-planning, and that's the wrong reason to do it. They were just trying to stop the bleeding of their budgets. And while that's a reality, I think where schools are right now and where we need to focus is, if this is going to be something that's going to stay, and I truly believe it is when you look at the research across the country and you look at the track record, regardless of a pandemic, virtual learning is here to stay in some way, shape, or form. We need to start doing things right now to be able to prepare for that. And whatever that is in terms of technology, digital content, training of teachers, you name it. But it's certainly something we have to pay attention to, because it is going to be, I mean, families will vote with their feet, right? And they'll start moving to other places where they can get the education that they need. And I say families because a lot of times this comes from the parents.
The training piece that you just mentioned, and Jamie actually in answering the question in the chat talked about the PD. I mean, that's this, like, if, and I tend to agree with what you're saying, that this, I think this is here. I think schools are gonna, choose to deal with it, or they're not. And if they don't, I think that there's going to be negative repercussions, or at least some loss of students or families. And that being said, I think then that means we need to start building those kids to be literate in this space at a young age. Meaning, really, even if we're not talking about online or virtual learning for elementary kids, and we're really still focused more at the middle and elementary, there is going to have to be a lot done at the professional development level for teachers at the elementary level, to actually start building some of this in, like, this learning model. As an example, I was talking to a friend of mine, our sons are both in 5th grade. And her comment as a teacher to my friend, she said, I will never teach 5th grade the same way again. Like, she has seen kids be more self-directed, more mature, more able to handle than what she thought they could handle. And she's, been amazed by it. Of course, she also has kids that have struggled mightily during this process. And so she has to figure that piece of it out. And so when we think about, as school districts, and maybe the investment, like, and beyond that, even if we're going to be, you offer some online program for kids that make that choice. But I think we're going to be in a space where teachers, even if we're not online, are going to have to start thinking about, are we, indeed in districts too, are we following a normal bell schedule, particularly at the high school level, because kids have recognized that freedom. They like some parts of the online component, but they don't want to go that way completely. So they're going to want to be in school for some of the time, but maybe not all of the time. And I think from a district governance standpoint, a lot of this has to be predicated on, does our staff have the skill set needed to move in this brave new direction that we're going to go? And with the pandemic, we were forced there. Now it's going to be about a choice in moving there. And, as I think for Chris and Shannon, like, you do a lot of work in the space related to teacher preparation and PD. What does this look like on the horizon? How do we get the elementary teacher so that they're incorporating it, so as the kids age, that they, whether they're in a blended learning or an online or an in-person, like, things are better for them and they have the ability to move if they want to. But for those that are going to be in the high school in a short term, like, what do these board members and superintendents say to their teachers? Like, this is a reality. What do we need to give you to get you ready for what kids are going to expect after this?
I think it's really opening that door that you are looking to see that type of innovation in their classrooms and use of technology. I feel in the past, if somebody were to walk into a classroom of an elementary classroom and see students on computers, they would think that that teacher wasn't doing a good job or was being, lazy and just, trying to keep the kids busy. I think now we have a different perspective that we can walk into those classrooms and see that this is an opportunity to engage kids in learning in a different format or space. And so I think there's opportunities to have promote teacher flexibility and how see where they can bring that opportunities to their classrooms.
And I second everything that Shannon said. One of the things that we've seen through research and just through working with informally with school districts is school districts that are focused on learning as opposed to teaching are the ones that fare better, that fared better during this pandemic. And what I mean by that is school districts where they're more student-centered, and there's a definition to that. That's where students have voice and they have choice, and you have some competency-based learning progressions where kids can actually self-pace and they can drive some of their own learning. That's what we mean by student-centered. The technology pieces really play a role in enabling that to happen because it's really hard to do if you don't have the technology like digital content and digital curriculum. And when we think about schools that want to be able to shift and move to be more student-centered like this and be more effective, regardless of whether we have a pandemic or not, or whatever else might come down the road that disrupts our traditional model of schooling. There's a digital component to this that needs to be attended to, and the professional development that's needed for teachers is pretty significant because a lot of our teachers, and I was this way too as a teacher for 11 years, what was modeled for me was traditional teaching and learning, and it wasn't more self-directed or technology-rich instruction. And when you're looking at digital curriculum and you're having kids work in an online or a virtual format, the classroom, the digital classroom looks very different and it functions differently. And the skills of the teacher get applied differently. But I would also argue this, Don, that the importance of the teacher becomes even greater because now the teacher becomes the architect of that environment and that student's learning experience. The technology can take some workload off teachers because they're not responsible for delivering all the content. They've created it, they set that environment, and now they can move forward. But what needs to happen is there needs to be some specific attention given to how we can get teachers from where they are now to be able to do something like that. And that's a pretty heavy lift, and it does take time.
And it's not just teachers, but other adults in the school community. One of the things that we've noticed at Michigan Virtual, as part of our program, we require there to be a local mentor available to support students. What we've seen as we have more and more students that are fully remote and they no longer have direct access to that mentor teacher, but also our teachers, we see the gaps in engagement. So it has just proven to us throughout this time frame how critical the adults are that play a variety of different roles in supporting students are.
And that's a great segue, Shannon. I appreciate all the things that are coming up in chat. I appreciate, Jamie, you trying to answer some of the Michigan Virtual specific questions. Stan posted a question or a comment about, I think from a generational perspective or whatnot, there would be a belief that, there is more benefit to in-person learning than just the instructional part of that. Social skills in younger grades, extracurriculars, athletics, just that adult interaction that you're talking about, Shannon, having an adult that they have contact with. I mean, a year ago, as we would think about trauma-informed schools, one thing we would talk about is every kid should have an adult in the school that they can turn to even if it's not a teacher, it could be a janitor, bus driver, doesn't matter, like they should have an adult to turn to. That becomes a harder delivery when you're in a virtual environment. And so clearly, we talked about it earlier, this is not always meant for everybody. And Chris, even what you said, how we deliver education, there's certain kids that bring other things to the table outside of the learning environment that schools would still have to find like a way to address. And Stan's final question though is, how do we preserve those benefits? And I'm going to take a stab at it myself and then let you guys chime in too. When I think about the demand for fully online learning, Jamie mentioned the one district that was at 9 to 12% could go in that direction. And I would say that maybe that's slightly high, but maybe not. But that means that 90% of our kids anyways, we're still going to be addressing in a face-to-face environment. And that 10% likely could become smaller if the district embraces kind of a hybrid model of learning. So like you were just both talking about how teachers react within this new classroom environment. So if we're incorporating technology, if we're letting some self-determination happen amongst these kids and self-pacing, they're feeling the freedom that they need, and they don't feel they need then to go to 100% virtual learning. So they are engaged in your school, they're in your normal schedule, whatever that looks like now. And so maybe all of a sudden you went from 10% looking for 100% online learning to maybe 5%. And so, Stan, to your question, they are staying engaged in your normal environment within the school community because you offer robust options that fill that need, because the number that will choose 100% online are still going to be slightly small. We see it at the adult level, as Chris mentioned, in a grad program or an undergrad program, but often that is time dependent. My job gets in the way or whatever it is. And for some people that just weren't comfortable in that in-class learning environment. But I think we keep them in our, I'll call it, say, traditional system with a much different look for a traditional system. And they get that engagement with social skills, extracurriculars, adult interaction, but only if we adapt what we're doing in our normal classrooms.
I think your point, Don, about particularly the extracurriculars is something that we see students still wanting to stay very closely tied to their school districts to be able to participate in. So I think that's very valid.
Don, I just want to step back and just, one of the things that Chris and his team do at Michigan Virtual in the Institute is we are directed by the governor and the legislature to basically do an analysis of online learning in the state of Michigan every year. And we're always a year behind in the data, but I know we're working on the report for the last school year right now. But if you looked at the 19 school year, we had around 600,000 online course enrollments that a little over 100,000 kids took. This is way before COVID. And this is from providers like Michigan Virtual, but also a ton of other providers are out there, as well as local solutions that are created without a vendor. And I will tell you that the completion rate, the statewide average completion rate for these online enrollments that have taken place, and we've been doing this study for about a decade, hovers around 55%. And some kids do very, very well in this environment. Other kids are crash and burn. In fact, there are thousands of kids, again, pre-COVID, attending Michigan public schools that are taking 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14 online courses, basically their whole schedule, and not passing a single course. And that happened before COVID, thousands of kids. So I share the concern that some families are going to make some really lousy decisions. But I would also say that there are some decisions that have been made for way too many kids that haven't been very good for the interest of the student academically. I think the schools that get out in front of this are probably going to want to create some standards and criteria. So, I've got one student left at home. The rest are adults and left. But, if I were running a school, I'd say, okay, well, what do we know about this student? What do we know about how they did during the pandemic? How can we best guide them to be making decisions that are going to be in their best interest, and not just willy-nilly leaving it up to mom and dad to say, well, my kid is going to get 100% virtual. There'll be parents that will try to go that route, but I think districts will probably want to try to create some quality indicators that help to at least create a little bit of a speed bump for parents who are, we know that there are families that have made decisions to enroll their kids in full-time cyber schools because they get a free computer.
Mhm.
Because the family doesn't have a computer and they want a computer. That's not a really good reason to have your kid in 100%, virtual learning environment. So I do think that, and I will put a link in there, but Don, we did work with the School Board Association a couple of years ago and put together actually a planning guide for school board members. And I think there's a sample policy in there that we helped co-write with you guys. So I just think that people are going to likely want to dust that off and kind of reevaluate where they are. Lots of decisions that are going to be made by policymakers.
Well, and that's actually one of the questions in the chat, and you just touched on it, Jamie. Is there guidance available for superintendents and boards to evaluate whether each student that wants to continue virtually should, or do we use this year as a basis for making that decision? If they did well this year, then we can move them in that space. And that is a hard space, because it's where I talked about earlier, which is somebody making that choice, like you just said, Jamie, like, I'm going to make this choice for maybe not great academic reasons because of a computer or whatever the situation might be. And it could be a poor decision, and the district has to make the decision, like, do I lose the student aid on that kid and let them go down that route? Do I try to keep them in a space where maybe because we offer a mentor teacher and a mentor adult, I'm going to have more connection through our online environment than a virtual school would offer? And I think this is going to be, like, that's why we're talking about it today, because districts are really going to have to grapple with this spring and this summer to figure out how each of you, and it will vary by connectivity and access within your districts. It will vary, depend on kind of the level of how students perform. Like there is some indicator related to that. And I'll use my daughter as an example. She's a sophomore in high school. We have been completely virtual this year. She thrived in the environment. She was good before, but her grades have been great. She has really high anxiety. She's a therapist to try to deal with that. So for us as parents, we're about to go back 2 days a week from now, and we could have left her remote for the rest of the year. And we know academically, she would have finished and had a great year. But we also understand that the longer that she's removed from an in-person environment, the harder it will be for her to transition back, and the harder it will be if we kept her virtual for the next 2 years to then enter college and enter adult. And so we're making a decision, not really on academics, but on kind of the whole child kind of conversation. And those are the kind of conversations that you hope that parents will have with their family and with districts that are not academic based, but are maybe mental health based, where you need to have a conversation about other things, when and why parents make decisions about their kids. That's a hard space, but it's going to be very, I think, up to districts to what this looks like.
Don,
but I don't know if you have guidance on what that can look like, Chris or Shannon.
Yeah, schools are doing this very well. There are schools that have their own in-house, fully online virtual programs where a child can take all of their courses online. The schools that do it really well and attend to that social aspect, they have structures built in so that there is some engagement with their school community. Okay, it could be participation in athletics, like our extracurriculars, like Shannon alluded to before. It could also be some clubs. It could also be some intramurals, bringing kids in for some school-wide assemblies where they're not necessarily needing to be there all day or even a part of the day for their academics, but there's that other connection piece. And certainly having access to some of the services that all the students who are face-to-face would get: counseling services, career guidance services, school psychology services, you name it. And so there are models out there on how to do this well. Somebody did put in a question in the chat about some standards or quality indicators. There is an organization, Michigan Virtual is part of the formation of some of these standards. It's called the National Standards for Online Quality, or Quality Online Learning. And I can throw that, there it is. Thank you, Jamie. Those are standards for how to teach in an online environment, how to design courses in an online environment, and standards of quality for programs in general. And that's what I'm speaking to there. And I want to also go back to something you said, Don. A small percentage of kids are the ones who are really going to be fully online, right? You've heard of this term blended learning or personalized learning. Well, blended learning is a blend between your face-to-face and your online. So it's like taking the best of both and putting them together in a coordinated program where the online activities and face-to-face activities work together to provide an educational experience for the kids. That's the sweet spot that most schools are finding. And that's why blended learning has just exploded across the country over time. And even fully online virtual providers are putting in these physical spaces for kids and families to meet up, because there is some of that interaction that is beneficial for a lot of the kids. So we have at Michigan Virtual, we do free online program reviews for school districts where we kind of give you like an audit of your program, and we can give you guidance and recommendations. And those are based on what it is you're actually trying to accomplish instructionally. What are your instructional goals? So we can certainly provide that for you. And on our team, I know we have experience in helping dozens of school districts actually design and implement their own in-house programs, and what all those pieces look like based on that individual school community. So yeah, if you're looking for more support in that and guidance, we can certainly put you in the right direction or have some extended conversations. Be happy to.
Question to you, Jamie. I think it's best to you. And just, I feel that you probably have better connections into this world. You know, one of the struggles that we still see, and it's not relegated just to rural areas, you know, the access question here has still been pretty huge. Urban centers, rural areas, even some larger suburban communities, you know, cell phone hotspots, and we've all been on adult Zoom calls where people's hotspots aren't working right. Like, what are you hearing in the larger field of technology to address that? I mean, we can have this great conversation about where schools go with online learning, and that only works as far as the kids actually being able to take advantage of that. And we're still really, and I don't think Michigan's alone, but we're still really short on the infrastructure to really make sure that every kid has, you know, an equal opportunity. And we have a number of states that have constitutions that talk about equal opportunities in public education. And as we move into a more online environment, that's going to be a problem holding a school accountable for when they aren't the ones controlling that.
Yeah, Don, it is a huge policy lift, not only for Michigan, but for the other 49 states. I have been mildly supportive or encouraged, I guess is the right word, by the work that we've seen with some of the federal stimulus monies that have come in. And I think a portion of those dollars have been used to try to get the instruments, the end device that the kids are going to need. But clearly the infrastructure, and I'm talking about, you know, earlier in my career, I worked in the Alpena area trying to support schools with technology. And I remember what a black hole that part of the state was 25 years ago. And in some cases that has changed, in other cases it has not, because you've got such a sparsely populated population that, you know, you could be a mile off of the main road and, you know, almost a 2-track to your house. And there's going to be a significant need for some of the wireless infrastructure, because I just don't see there's an appetite to do some of the traditional cabling that we do. So I've been encouraged by the movement that we've seen with devices. Obviously, schools have been, you know, wired and connected to the internet for a period of time, some better than others. We're starting to see some creative solutions come about where schools are taking their buses and converting them to Wi-Fi enabled instruments, and then strategically parking them in their districts so that they can get internet connectivity to their families. So we're starting to see some creative solutions come about, but I don't see this as a solution that's going to happen, you know, in months. It's probably going to be measured in years, unfortunately. And the one thing that this pandemic did do that was, I think, good, is it exposed, in a lot of ways, the weaknesses of our infrastructure in terms of not all of our families are being served by these technologies. But let's face it, it's 2021. You don't have access to the internet. It's kind of like saying you don't have access to electricity and public water. So it's a huge policy challenge that we're going to continue to face for years.
Thanks for that. I see it as a huge issue, and we have districts all over the state, and I see some that are on today are from the UP, and clearly some areas of the UP have great connection, others do not. I did 1 week this year with 2 kids in the UP on 5.5 megs of connectivity through a DSL line, and as long as they shut their video cameras off and staggered when they were in class, they both could be in class at the same time. But it's great for me. I was on vacation for a week, but for families that live there, that's not the case, and there was no cell phones, coverage in that space, and so therefore that wasn't a hotspot, wasn't even going to be an option, and that's all over the state in pockets. And so I think you're right, Jamie. It is a federal, not the stimulus. I think the feds are going to have to come up with a long-term solution, and that might be, as they've done in the kind of the energy space, it may be tax credits and other things for companies in this space to actually go out and build the infrastructure to make things work, because they look at it and say, there's no money in it for me, there's not enough customers here, and so those people are still relegated to not having that connectivity. So somebody right in Washtenaw County says their internet isn't.
It's really not all that different from the Rural Electrification Act that decades ago, that the country made it a priority, and it was predicated on a public-private partnership. We're just going to need to see more of that.
So Michigan Virtual, you've talked about how you currently provide courses on a we'll say on a one-off basis to kids in schools. They come in, they're filling out their schedule, they want to take 2 other classes that aren't offered in their school. As you see the environment changing at the school setting, are you having conversations internally that your model will end up changing too, or do you still think that there's a pretty large niche that you currently feel that makes sense that you will continue to fill that?
We will continue to be a supplemental provider, providing, Johnny wants to take AP Physics or Mandarin Chinese. That model does not scale with the demand that we saw this past year. And so we have created some new models. I don't know, Chris or Shannon, do you want to talk a little bit about whole school and how we think that that's probably a lot more of the future for us?
Sure. I posted a comment in the chat and in response to one of the questions, but we do have our own teachers. We have actually over 200 teachers, both full and part-time, that teach for us. But in addition to providing our in-house courses, we have established a collaborative model where we work in partnership with local districts to help them build and grow a local online option for their community, in which we will work with the school to train their local teachers to be able to provide online courses. Now, we can do that with supporting them in helping them build their own courses, or one of the models that we used this year was providing our course content, training the local school, and so that teacher wasn't holding the responsibility for having to develop an entirely new curriculum and learning to teach in a new environment. And in some communities having to teach in a face-to-face environment at the same time. So we've tried to help scale across the state and grow the opportunities that schools can provide locally.
So in addition to how we change our digital content offerings and how we've also shifted the professional learning, like Shannon mentioned, we did also expand a little bit, and we did some internal restructuring to be able to provide some consulting services for school districts. Because what we recognize is we have some stuff that you can use, but there's a lot that goes into actually making that work and making it be effective in the school district. And a lot of times that involves different facets of the organization, like your staffing, your technology, your professional learning, how that's structured in general. And sometimes there's even policies and procedures that are existing within a school district that need to be looked at to be able to enable what it is you're really trying to do from an instructional perspective. So we do provide that kind of guidance, and that goes along with strategic planning as well. So we're trying to give more of a 360-degree approach to supporting schools and districts now. So yeah, we've definitely expanded to be able to see where or to help schools where they're going. And we're in constant contact with different school districts to make sure that we always stay on top of what those needs are so we can anticipate as much as possible.
I posted in, thanks for that, Chris. I posted in the chat, if any of you as districts have already had many of these conversations and are moving in a direction, because you knew it was on the horizon. Maybe you did this 5 years ago. I can remember talking early in the pandemic. I don't know if it was Gull Lake or Richland, in that area, where they've had a virtual school for quite some time, and so this transition for them was easier than some. But so if any of you are in that space and would like to pipe in and share kind of the trials that you've already faced in this space, I think that would be helpful for those that are listening, to hear it from another school district rather than and I see Shannon posted Gull Lake and St. Clair. But if anybody wants to throw that out there, I think it's always good to hear from you. And I've appreciated all the questions that you've put in there so far. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm looking at my questions to see. I guess before I ask another, I'll turn to Chris and Shannon particularly. Like, even in the conversation that we're having today, what have we not hit on? Like, what is a space here as districts are looking at this? What do you see as the discussions they also need to be having beyond what we've brought up today?
Well, I think one thing in particular, in schools that I've been working with to help them go back to school for this current school year and looking towards the next school year, I think it's safe to say in a generalized way that school districts or school leaders in particular are realizing how much more connected they could have been to their families and to their kids, because the social emotional component that goes along with this pandemic has really underscored the need for that kind of connection and having the open dialogue and those touch points with the families. That's not going to go away. And when we look at more innovative learning models like personalized learning, that is a big component. So, if there's a silver lining here, that's been brought front and center to us is to be more deliberate about how we do that. Unfortunately, it was brought to us because of the pandemic, and there's some real pain going on in some of the families. But I think that is an area that needs to be considered moving forward, regardless of the degree to which you incorporate virtual learning in your programs.
I would add to the conversation we were having earlier about having structures and processes and policies in place. Michigan Virtual has benefited from years of being able to learn these things. And what we found as we worked with schools who launched in fall was there was an assumption that what we do in our traditional environment, whether it be teaching and learning, or whether it be our policies and structures, are just going to align, and they don't necessarily align. There needs to be some intentionality behind the decision making, and back to your original point, Don, about what needs to be in place. How do we make sure that this is the right learning environment for our students? These are processes and practices that need to be outlined before you launch the great announcement that you're offering this as a long-term opportunity. I think of the fact that we at Michigan Virtual have what we call a student orientation. It's a training course, and It's meant to be taken in like a day, maybe 2 days. And it includes 4 quizzes. Those quizzes are directly related to the reading and the learning that the students had to do prior. And what we have found from some schools is they come to us and they're like, this is too hard. They're struggling with these quizzes. And what our response back is, if they're struggling with those quizzes, they're going to struggle online. So what kinds of, instead of coming and saying we need to make the quizzes easier, we need to have a conversation about what supports we're going to put in place to help support the students, because that's part of what that is designed to provide, is feedback to us as adults on where the challenges are going to come for our students. So having those kinds of pieces in place before launching a program really helps provide for more of a successful launch.
And I think, you know, you mentioned policies and procedures within the district, and this is probably a space that, you know, after this call, you know, Jamie and I will probably as organizations need to have some conversations, because no matter what we do at the district level, I mean, there are still some hurdles, like how we set up pupil accounting as we move into this space, as this becomes more, you know, broadly based and different, you know, dealing with the legislature that is often sometimes taking this on in a, you know, as opposed to what is an instructional and learning model. They're looking at it as, is this school choice or not school choice? How does it impede or makes, like, it's not directed, or they're looking at it in a dollars and cents way, where clearly districts over time, this is a model that may be, you know, cost neutral. And I'm just throwing that out there. But in the short term, as districts need to go through changes and maybe need to add staff that can help them develop things, or they need to, you know, tackle other issues that surround this, just as we've seen in the pandemic, there's a cost to it. And just because things are online doesn't mean it's cheaper. And we've heard that during the pandemic, of course. Well, all your kids are gone, school's cheaper to run. And the budgets aren't bearing that out in most of our school districts. So, you know, I think there's some broader statewide discussions that the education groups are going to need to have, as the districts and all of you are sitting there trying to figure out this locally. We're going to have to, at the state level, come together and have some conversations about how do we approach the legislature in the not too distant future, and talk about, like, hey, there are districts this fall that are going to need to start making changes. And I don't know that our laws are set up right now in a way that makes it easy. Some of them, I mean, districts can do it. So you can do it with our current structure in place. But I think clearly flexibility can be in order in this space. And I think we'll have to work together to do that a little bit. Or it will continue to be, you know, the districts that can find the way. But, you know, this year, because of lots of executive orders and other things, it did pave the way for schools to kind of carte blanche, go down this road and know that they were going to be held harmless on a funding model. But that won't stay that way forever. So I just see that as a hurdle at the state level that we're going to have to overcome to help all of you as districts in doing this. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Jamie, but.
Yeah, Don, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a potential for some really lousy policy to be enacted without as much thought as is probably needed. And obviously, you want to give school districts, the latitude to do what, they want to do locally, but there are probably some overarching strategies that would benefit to the state and our public education system, and we're, as you know, we're always happy to engage in those conversations and, support your organization.
Well, we're coming up on one. I want to extend a thank you to the three of you for participating today. It was great. Before we got on with everybody, I said sometimes the conversations go well and it fills the time, and other times I've said a half an hour in, we're going to go to other topics, and we definitely filled it today. So I'm glad that all of you as members engaged in this conversation, and truly, all of the links that you posted in here were useful from an MVU. Sorry, Jamie, it's hard for me to get rid of the U in MVU, but I'll get there eventually. It's just, I really appreciate it. I think our members do also. Stacy has posted in here, if you have other ideas for future webinars, the things that you're starting to see on your horizon as school districts, that will be helpful to talk to each other about, or for us to bring somebody in to give you more information on, let us know. And we'll do that. And I'll give a last call to say, we've talked about online learning and kind of the struggles there. Any topics right now that you as board members or superintendents that are on there are like, hey, I've still got this outstanding question. I'll give you one answer, which is we still don't have in-person meetings. Jen has met with the new director of MDHHS this week, thought it was a favorable conversation. No promises made. We're going to wait for the next pandemic order to come out and see if we might get included. So we're hopeful that maybe in that order we can get somewhere on that issue. I will encourage you, if you have a board meeting this week, pass the resolution encouraging those meetings and send that on to both Jen and to Director Hertel at MDHHS. Other things that are out there that you're like, hey, what's going on with this item? I'm looking at ones that are out there right now and I haven't seen any yet, but I want to give you that opportunity if we can give you some clarification or a last question to Jamie and his team. All right, well, thank you all. Thank you, Michigan Virtual, for participating. Oh, I do have a question. What's everyone doing for learning loss and summer school? Please throw in the chats if you have answers on that. Melissa, I will say, as I'm hearing, at least through the grapevine, what we're seeing at the legislature, we are seeing a large portion of districts looking at a summer school program of some kind or another. We see both the governor and the legislature looking at funding for summer school programs. So you're not taking it out of your current allotment for per pupil expenditure. So it seems like it's going to be a direction that districts are going in, if not all of them, the vast majority, because when you've lost learning time, the only way to recoup that learning time is by extending, offering more of it. I like the idea of it as a future topic. That might be something that we'll want to bring up in the next, let's see, we're in March. So maybe even the April, maybe the April one, or at worst, the May one will be one where we want to make that as a topic. NWA tests have been better than expected for our district. NWA, Nick, that's a good point. I've heard from a number of superintendents. I don't know if other districts are seeing the same, at least in the initial testing in the fall and even at the mid-year. Reading seemed to be better than anticipated. The learning loss that was expected from March all the way through September didn't appear at the levels that a lot of school people felt that it would. The math area for a lot of schools, and it's no surprise when we think about reading versus math at home, the math learning loss was greater. Whether it hit the levels that people projected or not, I guess, is a question for each district. But math learning loss is clearly a space that in that summer school environment is one where a lot of focus could be used. And that's across your district, remember. And so if you start dicing those numbers, those kids most at need may still have seen larger learning loss than would have been anticipated. It's just that in some family situations, some of that was mitigated. So on average, you might have done better than you thought on reading, but you really need to look at each of your populations and figure out if that holds true in that NWEA data also. With that, we're after 1 o'clock. I don't want to keep Jamie and his team sitting here. So thank you to the three of you. Thank you all for participating today. Thank you for continued reliance on MASB for services. Let us know how we can help you, and we will continue to try to do so. So thank you all very much and have a great week.